and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton, with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of August 27th, 2026. With baseball season in full swing right now, it is a pleasure for me to welcome David Henkin back to the podcast to talk about his new book on how to think about baseball. David Henkin is Margaret Byrne Professor of History at the University of California, Berkeley. He received his bachelor's degree from Yale University and his master's and PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. He is the author of several books, including City Reading, Written Words, and Public Spaces in Antebellum, New York, published by Columbia University Press in 1998, The Postal Age, The Emergence of Modern Communications in 19th Century America, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2006, Becoming America, A History for the 21st Century, co-authored with Rebecca McLennan, published by McGraw-Hill in 2014 and in a revised edition in 2021. And The Week, A History of the Unnatural Rhythms That Made Us Who We Are, published by Yale University Press in 2021, which he joined me on Off the Deaton Path to talk about on April 12, 2024. His latest book, and the one he is here to talk about with me today, is entitled Out of the Ballpark, How to Think About Baseball, published by Oxford University Press just in time for baseball season this year on March 16, 2026. Long-suffering listeners of this podcast know how much I love sports in general and baseball in particular, and this book was a sheer delight to read. I thought I knew a lot about baseball, but I learned so much about the sport and its history and its connection to society and culture that, quite frankly, I didn't know. As one critic said of this book, quote, "I've always thought that baseball might just be everything. This book convinced me." Me too. My conversation with David Henkin begins now. David Henkin, welcome back to our podcast.
Lovely to be here. Nice to see you again, Stan.
The first question I have to ask is how did you, and you briefly refer to this, I think, at the beginning of your book, how did you talk the Oxford University Press into publishing a book about baseball?
Well, the truth is they approached me. I haven't written about baseball, but I was on some baseball panel at a conference. And the editor she's now retired, but the editor at the time of the very short introduction series that Oxford Press has done for years, approached me afterwards and asked if I would be interested in doing a book about baseball. And I said sure. And then it really became her job to talk the folks in the UK into the idea that baseball was worthy of the same treatment as Borges and and Copernicus and silent film and the blues and whatever. So yeah.
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 So so many places where we could start. But I wanted to start with a quote that I know you're familiar with, and I want to get it right because this is, few things have been romanticized in American cultural life the way baseball has. And I know that you've seen Ken Burns's baseball, which went on for many, many, many hours.
Yeah.
But he begins talking about a quote about the thing that America will be remembered, or the United States will be remembered for 2,000 years from now, are, of course, the Constitution, jazz, and baseball. And my question is, do you agree with that? After reading your book, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
And we'll dive into that. But would you agree that this is one of the unique contributions of the United States to world history?
Um, I guess the short answer would be no. I mean, there are two questions. One is, do I think that people will still remember baseball centuries from now, and will they
Mm-hmm.
associate it with the United States?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I think that's somewhat doubtful. Um, and then the other question is, to the extent that U.S. culture survives, will baseball be in the top three things it's remembered for, along with the Constitution and jazz? I suppose these days I'm a little unsure what the legacy of the U.S. Constitution is going to be either. I have less doubt about the durability of jazz and its association with the United States. But I could imagine someone predicting with some confidence that the NBA, rather than Major League Baseball, will be what the rest of the world remembers the United States for, or hip hop. I mean, there are many other sorts of things that the United States has exported. Um, and baseball is one of them. But to the extent that the United States has exported baseball, it is conceivable that it will no longer be associated primarily with American culture. So one obvious observation one could make is that there are many parts of the world where Japan, rather than the United States, is really the source of baseball. I mean, the reason why baseball is popular as a spectator sport in Korea and Taiwan, for example, is really about Japanese colonialism, not about American hegemony or military occupation. Um,
Hmm.
and then there are places like the Czech Republic or Brazil, where without the same sort of imperial history, where also baseball is likelier to be associated with Japan and thought of as a Japanese export than as an American one. The U.S. Major League Baseball continues to be the sort of the mothership, the mecca, the whatever, the real center of professional baseball. It's the place where baseball is played at the highest level, but that doesn't necessarily make it a uniquely American sport. We could speak about the NBA, for example. The NBA continues to be the place where basketball is performed at the highest level with the greatest number of fans. But often the best players are not American. And basketball is played enthusiastically in many other parts of the world, in Europe and Africa. So I think these things are a little harder to predict. Whether in the future baseball will be remembered as an American sport or not.
Hmm. One thing that's clear is after reading your book, because all baseball purists, and maybe not all, but baseball purists love to point out, as Ken Burns did, as that whole series did, that baseball is something that is uniquely American, right? It doesn't have a clock, et cetera, et cetera. And you sort of demolished that in your book. You do not think that there's anything. Well, first of all, you don't think there's anything unique about the sport. Am I right about that?
I mean, there are things that are distinctive about the sport, but most of what's interesting about baseball and most of what accounts for its impact in the United States and elsewhere is true of many other sports and true of many other things that aren't sports, many other forms of entertainment, many other forms of communal solidarity, many other forms of news consumption. So, right. So I'm skeptical about claims about the uniqueness of baseball. And then also the other question, of course, is how unique is the United States? And then even for people who believe that baseball is unique and that the United States is unique, is there sort of some obvious alignment between the two? So I guess I'm skeptical on all three counts. Right.
Right. Yeah. I think it is safe to say that you're a baseball fan, though.
I'm a huge baseball fan. I mean, one means many things by that. I'm a
Hmm.
baseball fan in the sense that I follow baseball. I always love to watch a baseball game, almost at any level, and I closely follow the goings-on of Major League Baseball in the United States, to a much lesser extent in other parts of the world.
Hmm.
But I'm also a partisan fan, which I think is a different phenomenon. One can be one without the other. Right? One can care very much about the fate of a team and not really know that much about the sport or follow it. And you can
Hmm.
certainly be someone who knows a ton about the sport, but whose emotional life is not really affected by the fortunes of a particular team. I am both. I am both, and I'd say even more intensely. I feel like attuned to baseball as a partisan fan. There are other sports that I follow with interest and some degree of knowledge. But there's no other sport where I really care as much as I do about who wins a game and who loses a game.
And of what team are you a partisan of?
For no obvious biographical reason, um, and perhaps for that reason, it seems much more just about me than about any community or any or any geographical identity. I am a fan of the St. Louis Cardinals. I've rooted for them since I guess I was about 6 or 7 years old, through times where it was a lot of fun to be a Cardinals fan and a few times where it was somewhat less fun. But I would say, and the other thing I would point out about partisan fandom is there are partisan fans for whom the relevant unit is the season. If a season's going well, that's good. If a season's going poorly, that's bad. If a season ends, as it almost always does, on a sour note, that sort of puts a cap on it. I'm actually not a season oriented. I'm actually, unfortunately, a game oriented. Every single game that I watch has significance, and I'm generally only as happy as the outcome of the most recent game. So that's an unfortunate fate to be consigned to. I should this has almost nothing to do with the book except I do have a chapter about partisanship, but
Hmm.
but mostly this required bracketing my partisan sympathies and in some sense sidelining the depth of my emotional interest in the game in order to think about it more objectively and to think about it from the perspective of people who don't necessarily know or care about baseball.
Hmm. Um, One of the fascinating aspects of your book for me was the discussion about investing so much emotional baggage into something you cannot possibly control. And we
Yeah,
all do it. I mean, if you're a sports fan and in the part of the world where I am sitting right now, and we'll talk about this a little bit too, college football, as you know,
right.
is huge. And I know people who absolutely put most of their emotional well-being in what a bunch of 18 to 22-year-olds do on any given Saturday afternoon, and they will be depressed for days, or if not weeks, depending on the outcome of a game. If they win the SEC championship, if they go to the college football playoff, and they have absolutely nothing to do with the outcome, they can't change it. Just like you and I are talking about baseball, and I find that phenomenon, and that's we saw it in the World Cup, right? I mean, we just had a wonderful example of what you're talking about, the partisan fans. I mean, and then of course nationalism is wrapped up in that too, which is a whole different conversation, but maybe it's related. It's still about investing yourself into something. I mean, we saw people crying at the outcomes of game. What is it? And now I'm sort of putting this at a different level. What is it about sport and organized competition that makes us or even allows us to do that?
Okay, so first thing I would just observe, and this is I think where your question is coming from, is notice how not particular to baseball this is,
Mm-hmm.
right? Uh, um, in many ways, the clearest example of the depth of partisan investment in a entertainment form in the United States is college football. Uh, and in fact, college football is a closer analog to baseball in Japan than baseball in America is to baseball in Japan. So good, right? So this is not really just about baseball. Uh, it's certainly about sports. I'm not sure it's only about sports. I would say I mean, sports are the best example of it, but I'd say it's about um, practices and spectacles of mass competition that are of interest to large numbers of people, where the outcome is unknown, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
or the outcome is ideally and putatively unknown. So you could have that, I suppose. And we don't really, but I could imagine a world in which we had that about the Oscars or something like that. Um, I do think there's a way in which we have it about electoral politics. Uh, Now, the difference there in electoral politics is people can usually talk, if they really care, they can usually talk about why, and they can talk about, what might be the social consequences, the policy outcomes, the moral significance of one side winning or another side losing. But the phenomenon of wanting something to happen, knowing that lots of people care about it, and there are people on your side and people on the other side, and you don't know for sure what it's going to be, but you imagine that some small thing you can do will affect the outcome. Now, the difference between electoral politics and sports is that in electoral politics, we do something that we know is wildly unlikely. Our individual vote is unlikely to determine the outcome of an election, but we still understand the connection between our vote right? It's statistically negligible, but it is actually instrumentally efficacious in some way. With sports, we don't, and so I think it leads us to indulge the forms of magical thinking that connect our desires uh, to events in the world. So now we're talking a little bit more how sports fandom resembles religion rather than how it resembles politics. But uh, we sort of imagine that not just every little thing that we do might make a difference, but every little thing that we feel and think. You think all the superstitions that sports fans have. You know, do you turn the sound on or off? Do you let your brother-in-law sit next to you on the couch because you remember back in 1993 when he did that and they fumbled?
Right.
So
Put your hat on backwards in the ninth inning, right?
yeah, right, exactly. All the sartorial superstitions that we have in sports. Baseball is especially ripe with that. I think just because there's so much downtime. Um, where something is about to happen, or maybe nothing will happen. And so there's a lot of opportunity for your magical thoughts or your ominous or auspicious rituals to have an effect. So I think it has something to do with unknown outcomes. And sports, or at least like competitive spectator sports, team sports are especially likely to produce that. I mean, there's no reason why one couldn't have this feeling about golf or boxing either, but there's something about team sports that induces fans to imagine that they are part of the team, right? Because the
Hmm.
team is a big amorphous entity. It's much bigger than any one player or even all the players on the current roster. And so I think to the extent that fans fantasize that they are somehow involved in the action, the structure of a team is slightly more conducive to that fantasy than say tennis, boxing, golf, whatever, right? Yeah.
And because we're historians, and this is a podcast and part about history, how did that phenomenon play out before organized team sports into things like leagues and associations and clubs? In other words, if you lived in one of the American colonies in 1750, would this phenomenon had still existed in some way?
I would argue no, that the mass spectacle is key to this.
Hmm.
I mean, people have all kinds of magical thoughts about everything, from their own personal health to the fate of a harvest. So it's not that that is new,
Hmm.
but the idea that watching a form of competitive entertainment uh, ropes you into this sort of emotional investment. I do think that that is really about modern spectator sports in the sense of competition covered in the media with statistical record keeping, continuity over time, competition meaningful beyond local circles. So in 1750, people played things that we would call sports. They also called things sports that we wouldn't call sports. Billiards, backgammon, cards, uh, also going to the theater, even going to a brothel. These
Hmm.
are things that were thought of as part of sporting culture. But none of those activities, even when they were things we would call sports, like horse racing, uh, or a game of cricket or whatever. I don't think that that would have produced this phenomenon because they were not mass spectacles. They were not covered in the media. They were not things that seemed remote. I think the paradoxical feature of what we're talking about, which is that you're not only imagining that what you do and what you think might affect a game in which you're not a participant, you're thinking about it often about a game you're not even watching, right? And or you're not watching live, and
Hmm.
that you're very far removed from, and that is really in some ways an abstract event. Uh, and so I think that's part of the whole picture of partisan fan investment. And I do think that is in that sense a modern phenomenon that I would say originated in the United States in the middle of the 19th century, which is when the sporting press, statistical record keeping, and as you point out, clubs, associations, leagues uh, organized the sport into a mass spectacle that had the status of public news.
So much that even somebody who thinks they know the game will learn in reading your book. That you mentioned, we talk about baseball being a global game, and it wasn't really. The United States did not introduce baseball into Japan post World War II. It was in the 1870s.
Right,
Something I did not know. It's in Cuba. It's in Central and South America, and now, of course, there's a World Cup of baseball, right? I mean, we
right.
see this, and you see that Great Britain has a team, and I mean, it's a kind of a joke a little bit, but of course, it's not a joke looking at the Korean team, right, and looking at the
Right.
or the South Korea
Yeah, the
team.
European teams are sort of funny because it's when you discover that some fairly marginal Major
Yeah,
League Baseball player who grew up in in the in the Central Valley of California happens to have Italian ancestry.
right. Yes.
Uh, so there's a little bit of that, right? There are teams like Italy and Israel and well, those might be obvious examples. And then there are teams like Britain and Australia, where there are a few major league players that you may or may not have known were from those countries. But it is, as you say, it's quite different if you're talking about Korea or Venezuela.
Right. That's where I was going. Yeah.
These are all-star teams. These are dream teams. The Major League Baseball is full of foreign stars.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and one thing that's sort of interesting is I always take interest in the team from the Netherlands. So compared to the World Cups, the World Cup, Curacao made the World Cup this year in
Mm-hmm.
World Cup soccer,
Mm-hmm.
that is, uh, and all their players essentially live in the Netherlands. Um, because that's where player development and the level of competition is high. So baseball players who represent Curacao are really from the Netherlands.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, the soccer players, I mean, who represent Curacao are the Netherlands. In baseball, it's the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Baseball, it's Team Netherlands that competes in the World Baseball Classic. And all those players live and play in Curacao because baseball player development and level of competition is much higher there.
Mm-hmm.
So some of these there are interesting traces of uh, of the colonial histories of these countries. But yeah, baseball is a global sport. It's not a global sport the way that soccer is, and I think any
Mm-hmm.
attempt to make that comparison is a little bit either disingenuous or a stretch. But it is a sport played in many different countries by people who with different national identities, and that's important to acknowledge. Yeah.
And that's not a new phenomenon. Your book makes that clear. That's been
Yeah.
going on for 100+ years. I mean, Venezuela won the World Cup of baseball this year, uh, and that might have happened 100 years ago.
It's possible. I mean, you know, um, we don't know uh, how some of those 100 years ago, whether a player from Venezuela would have been competitive with, with I don't know, Pepper Martin or
Hmm.
Pie Trainer or whoever because they didn't play against each other. And players from Venezuela mostly played amateur and did not play in substantial professional leagues. Cuba is an interesting. Cuba is really the center. It's the
Hmm.
of Caribbean baseball, and Cuban players did play in the major leagues, and American white and black players played in Cuban leagues. So it is a little easier to speculate as to whether a team from Cuba might have been competitive in international baseball competition in the 1920s or 30s, or whether players from Mexico might have been competitive. I don't think they would have won a World Baseball Classic then. But again, it's hard. It's a little hard to say because
Hmm.
they didn't play each other as often unless they were in Cuba.
Hmm. One of the things that baseball has that we all know, and you love this or you hate it, or you're usually not indifferent about it, is statistics. I mean, endless number of statistics. You talk about how individuals keeping score of a baseball game is really, it is a unique thing among
Yeah.
sports. And this has been going on for a very long time. You had a fascinating discussion about the history of the box score, which I study every morning to see how the Braves did. And I want to read a little quote from your book. We have more detailed, exhaustive, and reliable information about what happened on baseball fields over a century ago than about any other aspect of leisure culture, popular entertainment, or daily life in the United States from that era. Fans or historians can authoritatively answer the question of what happened in the third inning of a game played in 1933. Why is that? What is it about this
Yeah, so
sport
I
in
mean, I'd say that's
particular?
one of my favorite parts of the book too, and because really it speaks to me or from me in this case as a social historian, as someone
Mm-hmm.
who is really interested in reconstructing details of everyday life from past societies and specifically from North America. So yeah. So I didn't notice how much we know about it. So I in the book I suggest that in some ways this is a legacy of a particular ideological approach to sports that was championed and epitomized by Henry Chadwick, an English-born immigrant to the United States uh, who developed much of the vocabulary, the discourse, and the rhetoric of baseball record keeping. And Chadwick and people like him were interested in assigning credit or blame to individuals on the field. And I would say there are two things that made that project especially compelling to them. One was the fact that it's a team game and it's not as obvious as it might be in a sport where one person scores single-handedly, or one person knocks somebody else out, uh, you know,
Yeah.
double-handedly. It's not as obvious who should get credit for it. And on the other hand, it was very important to him as middle-class Protestant reformer to assign individual responsibility for for gameplay. So even the idea of the earned run, just the idea of merit, and it is sort of shot through the early statistical vocabulary of baseball journalism. And yeah, and so I think it's a lot about that. Now Chadwick also was a big believer, as many reformers were in the 19th century, of the capacity of large numbers to accurately describe societies and to diagnose social problems and to determine moral worthiness. I point out that Chadwick's half brother is the architect of the British poor law, in many ways the designer of Britain's welfare state. It's a parallel project. I mean, it's much more important, maybe the British one, but it's a parallel project. This reliance upon statistics, especially big statistics, which is why Henry Chadwick loved the batting average. This is now a routinely scorned and depreciated statistical category, though it's usually the lead statistic attached
Mm-hmm.
to every baseball card, every scoreboard display, etc. So it has legs, but it is justifiably the batting average is justifiably criticized as being sort of arbitrary because it doesn't count walks, and more significantly, it doesn't distinguish between the magnitude of a single and a home run. So there's that. It also doesn't actually tell you whether a hit led to a run. So in other words, it doesn't tell you whether the hit had any role in determining the outcome of the game.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
Chadwick loved this. He didn't make it up, but he loved this statistic because it suited his goal. So I mean, baseball statistics isn't just about Chadwick, but I do argue that it's somehow sort of built into the DNA of baseball as a spectator sport to be concerned with statistical achievements. And I point out that a lot of baseball statistics are not really all that relevant to game outcomes. So, for example, the difference between uh, assigning someone an error or calling it a base hit, no consequence for the game. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but, someone needs to make this judgment. the official scorer, this figure that really has no counterpart in other sports, and a whole army of people or a whole infrastructure of record keeping needs to register that judgment. And these are some things that I think are just. So I said before that there are things that are distinctive to baseball. The ones that interest me most have to do with the official score.
Hmm. Um, in talking about average, I recently read an article about Luis Ariz, who of course just got traded from San Diego. He's baseball's best hitter by average, right? He's won the
Yeah.
batting crown for several years. He got traded to the Philadelphia Phillies, and there's an article in the Wall Street Journal sports section about the fact that the kind of baseball he plays, average, is just not prized anymore. And that it really, yeah, he hits well for average, but he usually makes no difference on the team that he's on. And it is kind of a strange, which is I don't know if that's literally true or not, but I mean, I'm paraphrasing what the article was
Yeah.
about, but it is a very strange way of judging how valuable a player is.
It is. I mean, I think the Arias example is a complicated. People, it's been fashionable, on fan websites and all that to think of him as a replacement level player.
Hmm.
But in fact, I think if you take into account his defense, his on base percentage, the number of pitches he sees, and one could make an argument that he's better than people think. But yes, the batting average for fans in the know these days, it's the batting average is considered a an overrated category, but on base percentage is not. On base percentage is still. In fact, anyone who's watched or read Moneyball will appreciate the fact that on-base percentage is in some ways the statistic du jour, or at least was 20 years ago, and
Hmm.
that is also about an average, and that also is about something that doesn't necessarily affect the outcome of a game. Uh,
Hmm.
so anyway, we're getting into the weeds here, but
We are getting into the
yeah. So
weeds,
I'll
but
let
but
you
it
drag
goes
us
to
out.
well, and all this business about the statistics, and you mentioned, nowadays we've got things like spin rates and exit velocity and launch angles and defensive runs, the WAR, right? All of these things,
Mhm.
which are incomprehensible to the average fan. And to be honest, even people like me, who I grew up watching in the 1970s, and every batter who came up, there were three things, right? Your average, your home runs, your RBIs. You literally never heard anything else. And for a pitcher, of course, as you just mentioned, it's wins and losses and ERA, which again is that it's assigning individual blame or responsibility. At the end of every game, there's a winning pitcher and a losing pitcher officially, right? In addition to the team who won and lost. And again, I don't know where all of this fits into the history of organized sport or collective sort of competition, but there's something about this game and that it's hard to imagine it developing in some ways without all of this. It drives, I think, a lot of the things that you write about, the desire to follow a team, the desire to talk about it, without the box score, um, keeping score of a game. It separates it, does it not, from things like soccer, football, hockey, basketball in that sense.
It does. I mean, I think lots of the other sports do participate in some of the statistical obsessiveness of baseball, and the proliferation of fantasy sports and of proposition bet gambling has contributed to that.
Mm.
And it's now the case you watch a soccer game and you'll be told the number of successful passes, the time possession, the average speed of each soccer player. So it's I don't think it's exactly unique to baseball, but I do think baseball pioneered it. And baseball has rendered it very visible and intelligible to fans. So that's the irony. So people often say, baseball is hard to follow because it's all this like statistical gibberish or all this this thicket of acronyms and numbers. And it's true that to really understand all of that requires expertise, much as many things do. But one could make the opposite argument that the baseball's interest in statistical record keeping actually has fueled fan interest and has rendered it more accessible to people. I don't make this argument in the book, but I'll say it
Yeah.
now. So
Hmm.
immigrants to the United States in the early 20th century, many of whom came from places that didn't speak English or didn't even use the Roman alphabet, had access to baseball through the discourse of numbers. Kids who collected baseball cards in the second half of the 20th century had access to games that they often weren't able to watch uh, through the back of the baseball card numbers. People who were able to memorize batting averages or compare, one loss records of pitchers were able to enter into arguments in bars about games that they might not otherwise really have been able to follow. So there is, I think, a way in which the statistical culture of baseball actually contributed to its popularity and to its visibility, its legibility, and uh, and led to a kind of proliferation of discourse among fans. So if that's what sports fandom is really about, it's about people being able to talk about something. One could argue that the statistics, rather than being a barrier to entry, have actually been the door, have been
Hmm.
have have roped people in, welcomed people in, have even in some respects democratized access.
Let's talk for a moment about the people who were and in some cases are barred from playing in Major League Baseball. Almost from the beginning, of course, it was a white sport, but there were always teams. You note, of course, the Negro leagues, black leagues, before African Americans were allowed to play in Major League Baseball. They had their own teams, but there were also all women teams, were there not?
There were so I mean the I would distinguish two kinds of all women baseball clubs. One is really the classic club model. So in all women's colleges, you could have women gathering to play baseball. Vassar College had a baseball club that is older than the National League.
Mm.
In other words, older than 1876.
Hmm.
But they didn't play in front of spectators and they didn't play against men. So that's a little bit different. There were also barnstorming teams, in other words, teams that played outside of the structure of league competition that were eh, featured women or included women, right? So you could have what we would call a co-ed team, barnstorming team. Um, and as with the case of black players in the 1870s and 1880s, this is often popular with fans to have black players on, and black players were on major league teams in the 1870s and into the 1880s. Uh, and barnstorming teams would have women really even longer than that, and fans enjoyed that. The exclusion of black players and the exclusion of women are two really different stories, slightly different timelines. One of them, I think, makes more historical sense. It really does follow uh, other patterns in the history of race relations and the history of Black America. The women's
Hmm.
story, and both these stories I tell in the book, a little bit more complicated, but in both cases, uh, professional baseball drew a hard line, keeping the game a game for white men. There were exceptions. Indigenous men, Native Americans, were typically allowed to play. They were often um, tokenized or even fetishized, but it was not considered a violation of any unspoken or unwritten rule. Uh, Players of Hispanic origin could be on the baseball field if their skin was white and they were perceived as being Iberian in heritage, even often that they weren't. So it was a little messier. The one point I do make about the race line is I think the race line was the color barrier was instituted by white players rather than by fans or by management. I think fans and management were and would have remained much more tolerant of black players in professional baseball. But it was the white players' sense of their own gentlemanly honor and all of the with all of its racial implications
Hmm.
that made it. That made it very difficult for black players to join. It's part of a larger phenomenon in the history of black athletes in the United States, which is that black Americans could compete against white Americans and did famously in track and field, and of course in boxing. The real barrier was the team. The idea that having a black teammate was somehow demeaning to the honor of white players was really the sort of cultural taboo that became enforced in the late 1880s and remained in place. Black Americans did play baseball, and they played baseball in Cuba. They went down to Cuba to play baseball, as did white
Hmm.
Americans,
Hmm.
and they played on barnstorming teams. And then after the Great Migration of Black Americans from the rural South to the urban Midwest and Northeast, there developed a market for black baseball, and that is the history of the Negro Leagues. But that really didn't begin till the 1920s. That's really after the Great Migration. The women's story is more complicated. We could talk about that. I
Hmm.
have a chapter in the book about that also. But a little bit different because unlike with Black Americans, there were not a lot of women playing baseball at the level um, uh, of the major leagues, and the taboo against women playing was enforced at a much earlier age. And it was like
Hmm.
the stigmatization of girls' baseball and the creation of this alternate sport of softball as a means of keeping youth baseball all male is an interesting story and in many ways distinguishes baseball from, say, basketball or even football.
Hmm. One of the fascinating chapters, and they're all fascinating, is labor and capital. Baseball it's hard to follow the sport without having to also know something about labor relations in this sport and the history of them. But one of the things that, in the way that you describe it, that I confess that I had never really given a lot of thought to, is the fact that even early on, especially early on, even after slavery ended in the United States in 1865, the idea of team management owning these players, you were not free to leave one team and go to another team. You were not free to, you were sort of, as long as you wanted to play baseball, you had to play for the team that owned your rights. Um, did baseball as organized sport begin that? In other words, before it, did it, where did the idea of owning these people come from? I guess from the time that they organized sports, but it does seem to be now. It's, of course, all sports do that. This is how you put together a team. But I guess what I'm asking you is that the whole idea of owning someone and then basically until the free agency in the 1970s, for 100 years, baseball players could not choose who they wanted to play for.
Yeah, so I mean, I think my answer might make it sound like I'm more sympathetic to the reserve clause than I am. I totally am not. I'm on the side of the players in every single labor dispute, and will continue to be next year. But I do want to say that the claim it wasn't really that we owners own the players. I think it's that the league uh, essentially owns the players and that the owners are collude within the league to create the game. And and players were not owned by uh, uh, were not entirely owned in the 19th century. They could go to a different league, and there were multiple leagues, and that was part of what drove the proliferation of leagues. The existence of another league was what gave players some iota of bargaining power. But from the league's perspective, uh, the league creates the entertainment product, right? It's not like I don't know um, opera or ballet where the extraordinarily talented performer can just get up and do it. And it's not even like boxing or juggling competitions or dance challenges where a manager would just put together two people and sell their competition. The league was selling something complicated. And this is, I think, really underappreciated in the history of sports. The league is selling a universe in which competition becomes meaningful over time. Uh, and the league is selling like the boundary between games that count and games that don't, statistics that count, statistics that don't. So again, I don't mean to be sympathetic to this position, but just to say what I think the logic of the position was. Logic of the position is that the league is actually the entertainment product, and I think that that's a fairly um, you know accurate claim.
Hmm.
On the other hand, the league is nothing without the talented players, uh, because fans don't want to see, mediocre people compete. They want to see the very best people compete the same way they want to see the very best opera singer and ballet dancer perform. And that's sort of the structure of the problem. The league really is the entertainment product, and the players are uniquely situated to to make that entertainment product of a high, compelling quality. So that's the balance, and the leagues basically shut out the players over time by eliminating extra league competition.
Hmm.
Right? The players formed a players' league, a cooperative players' league in the late 19th century, but it could not sustain at scale a profitable business. And so the National League ultimately just uh, kept surviving its rivals to create something of a monopoly. And then when the American League rose and proved somewhat viable itself, the National League decided instead of trying to drive them out of the market, to collude with them and respect each other's blacklists. So then once that happens, then the players really have a diminished bargaining position. There's no other league to go to. Uh, the two leagues are increasingly profitable and successful. Fans are coming to the games. Salaries are rising, but you have to play by their rules, and their rules included a reserve clause that does resemble, as Kurt Flood would argue before the Supreme Court, decades later, does resemble one aspect of slavery, which is
Hmm.
the inability to determine your employer.
Yeah. So, just real quick for the benefit of our listeners, what was the reserve clause?
The reserve clause itself was ambiguous, but the reserve clause gave the team the right to extend a player's contract for 1 year, right? It originated in something a little bit more like what you have in other sports now, like the idea of a franchise player that a team could do that for its best players. But very quickly, it turned into something they could do for all their players.
Hmm.
So players' contracts were automatically renewed. I say it's unclear because part of the way that the players' union in the 1970s essentially got rid of it was by getting an arbitrator to say that's not what the reserve clause means. It can do it once and only once. And so once there was a little bit of debate as to what the reserve clause actually meant, the owners were in big trouble. But yes, historically, the reserve clause meant that the management had the right to retain you at the same terms for the following year,
Yeah.
which was understood to mean they can keep you as long as they want,
Right. Your contract's up, but you're not going to go out and then wait for the
right?
highest bidder to come
Because your
in.
contract effectively is not up, right?
Right. Right.
Was
It
how
was
the
never up.
yeah yeah
Yeah.
it's all I mean, it's only up when we say it's up, right? Yeah.
Hmm.
So in that sense,
Was
it's
it was Andy Messersmith the first real free agent. I mean, in these parts of the woods, Ted Turner, who recently died, it was hailed as being, he went out and signed him for $1 million.
Yeah. I mean, so Dave McNally, Dave McNally, and the later Catfish Hunter. So the players who got released from their reserve clause contract by an arbitrator are technically, I'd say, the first. Uh,
Hmm.
Messersmith, along with Hunter, I think, are usually
Hmm.
regarded as the first people to uh, to demonstrate the free agent market.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah.
And of course, baseball does not have a salary cap. It's one of the things that it's been the headlines right now.
Yeah,
And
and I
they
don't
have
think
a
it will. I mean,
yeah.
I'm not an expert on the business of Major League Baseball, but I think that that's obviously what the owners want. It's obviously what
Hmm.
the players don't want. I think the players will wind up giving up many things before they give up that, and I don't see what would force them to even contemplate giving that up.
Yeah, yeah. Um, One of the things you talk about, and this is still related to stats a little bit, was that for so long the idea of being able to manage a team or being able to put together a team was really about just sort of feel, right, and instinct. Before the idea, before Moneyball and all that, and of course, one of the things you do in this book is say, oh no, statistics have been around forever. Maybe not employed in exactly the same way, but it is. You mentioned that you were a St. Louis fan. It's hard to imagine Whitey Herzog or Don Zimmer, right? Those old school managers poring over statistics and those things.
I mean, this doesn't really negate your point at all, but I would resist that image of Whitey.
Okay.
Uh, Don Zimmer, sure, maybe Grady Little, I don't know.
Yeah.
Uh, I think what Whitey prepared very hard.
Hmm.
Whitey was very smart, and Whitey figured out not based on feel, but based on numbers,
Hmm.
how to build a team around an artificial turf
Right. Yeah.
stadium. So
Yeah.
strategy, including quantitative strategy, has long been part of the game. The example I focus on in the book is Branch Rickey. I mean, Branch Rickey is who is most famous for his role of signing Jackie Robinson and integrating the National League in 1947. Was also very interested in statistics and hired a full-time a statistician. And some of the moves that he made, including where to put Jackie Robinson in the lineup, and decision of which white players to trade among those who resisted Robinson being on the team. Those decisions, I argue, were in many ways, or to a large extent, guided by statistical analysis of exactly the sort uh, that is celebrated in Moneyball.
Hmm. One of my favorite parts of your book are just woven throughout. You sort of just very calmly demolish some of the myths. Just this timeless game, and you say, "Oh no, it wasn't always three strikes and four balls. The distance between the mound and home plate has not always been the same. The height of the mound has changed a lot. Presumably, even the distance between bases probably changed at some point." And you go through and talk about how those things were not really sort of carved in stone. It's the rule of law, as you call it, the rule book, which this week any baseball fan who's a fan, let's say, of the Boston Red Sox knows that the rule book can still come into play in a way that it's just
Yeah,
it's
that was a
mind,
great that was a great moment. I mean, I don't know
wasn't it?
when this podcast is going to air, but right now everyone's thinking about the rule book. That's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there are little things like you point out, is something that I always have a good time with, which is baseball. I think is the only sport in which the people who manage the teams dress the same way. It's always fun to think about guys sitting around in tank tops in basketball or football wearing
Or
helmets,
three-piece suits,
three-piece suits, which uh, and not, maybe this is trivial, but why is it that baseball managers dress that way and not like Connie Mack wearing suits?
I don't know. I mean, I should just say I'm not sure. The standard answer that I always heard growing up was that this was a vestige of the player manager, a
Yes.
much more common phenomenon. We've had player managers in your lifetime and
Hmm.
mine, since you're a Braves fan. and I'm a Cardinals fan, will recall that Joe Torre, who played on both of our teams, was a player manager for the Mets.
Yes.
Um,
Hmm.
and
Pete
so
Rose. Hmm.
Pete Rose, so there have been but the player manager was a more common phenomenon 100 years ago, and it may be a vestige of that. Now, the player manager itself, I think, goes back to the ideal of the baseball team is a club, uh, and so all of the people who run the club are also good at baseball and they're players, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's w what it comes from. Um, but I don't really understand for sure what has preserved it. Uh,
Hmm.
the consequence of it that I enjoy is that all kinds of people who are not actually playing are in uniform, and so many fans are in uniform also, right? And the fans just all sit there with their jerseys with some
Hmm.
player's name, sometimes their own name, and a number. So I do like the way in which it most obviously blurs the line between player and management, but it also blurs the line between team member and team supporter,
Hmm.
which is interesting to me from the perspective of partisanship. Yeah.
We talked earlier about the prevalence and popularity of college football. One of the things you pointed out that I don't think I'd ever thought about was the fact that college baseball came after professional baseball, and that's why it's really never been that popular. It's always been a sideline.
Correct.
That
It,
that
it
that.
it distinguishes it not only from football, which is the opposite. Football
Hmm.
was an amateur sport that only, I mean, in the scheme of things, only really somewhat recently became a
Right.
popular professional sport. Also distinguishes it from baseball in Japan, which once again really more resembles American football in the sense that it was
We'll
really
talk
a,
about that.
a high school and college sport for
Hmm.
decades in
Hmm.
Japan, and only really became a popular professional sport in the really beginning of the 30s, but then really much more so after the war. Yeah, so baseball, unlike American baseball, unlike Japanese baseball, and unlike American football or American basketball, was a professional sport before it was a college sport. It was a professional sport very, very early on.
You had the opportunity to attend a baseball game in Japan. You talk about this a little bit and describe, because it was new to me, what the atmosphere is like at a Japanese baseball game.
Yes, I've been to a number of games in Japan, and again, it's a somewhat simplistic analogy, but it holds. It's much easier to feel like you're at a college football game in the sense that for their cheerleaders, there are there's a lot of bands playing brass instruments and percussion throughout, a lot more coordinated, synchronized cheers, and there is a massive section of fans on the other side of the park rooting for the visiting team. So
Mm.
there are many things that make it it's festive. I would distinguish for those listeners who are thinking of going to Japan. I would distinguish between going as a game at the Tokyo Dome to see the Yomiuri Giants and all the rest. If you have to go to one game, do not. I would say go to the Tokyo Dome is the least distinctive
Mm.
atmosphere. It's big. It's a dome, right? It's
Hmm.
massive. And there's like big screens blaring. If you're in Tokyo, go see the Yakuza Swallows. If you're in Osaka, go see the Hanshin Tigers. Those stadiums are smaller. They're packed. And you can really sort of much more feel the prominent role of the cheering section
Hmm.
as it's sort of its own entity. And I mean, there are other things that distinguish it and make it fun. The snacks are, as you might imagine, quite different. Uh, the very young women carrying kegs of beer on their back. The lack of interest in foul balls. Every time a foul ball leaves the field, there's an automatic warning. Beware of foul balls. Be very careful. A batted ball. There are a lot of little things that distinguish it, but overall, I would say it is an atmosphere that more nearly resembles college football than Major League Baseball.
And I'm sure you saw this summer. We mentioned the World Cup being played here in the United States, and one of the phenomenon was the team's fans would go visit American baseball stadiums and
Right.
bring some of that energy that you're talking about. It
Yeah,
happened to
that's
the Braves when England
yeah
was playing in Atlanta.
the kilt army and
Oh, yeah.
yeah
And I
the
wondered if
Nor the
any of that.
Norwegian rowing team.
Yes, yes. And
Yeah.
it really brought an energy and an excitement that I think baseball fans were startled because there is something about the fact that it's that sedately paced, laid back. You sit down with your beer and your hot dog and you watch the game, right? And I wondered if any of that was going to rub off and maybe in a permanent way, and it doesn't seem to have done that.
Well, in St. Louis, the fans in the right field section with
Yes.
their they go topless. I think that
Yeah.
in some ways is a vestige of
Hmm.
World Cup. Though I just one of the important things about the point that you just made is that the sedateness of a baseball crowd that is often in America that is often attributed to the game itself. That's a misattribution because look, in the game structurally is the same in Japan.
Hmm.
With
Hmm.
very, very minor rule differences, or even very minor strategic differences. But the same game can produce a very sort of festive, much more like college football in America or soccer in other parts of the world. It can produce that kind of fan experience. So another reason not to be sort of deterministic about the relationship between the structure of baseball, which does have implications and consequences,
Hmm.
but it doesn't determine the cultural experience of baseball as a spectator sport.
So much else that we could talk about. The last thing I just want to touch on very briefly and just ask your opinion about is one of the great myths about baseball being unique is that it is not ruled by the clock. Unlike almost every other sport, we witnessed it, of course, with the World Cup, right? There's this mysterious time or whatever, but it's all about time. Baseball, of course, could be played for 5 hours. If you were Greg Maddux, you might play for 2 hours and 20 minutes. But there's things that have come into the game that have supposedly changed this. Of course, the pitch clock, for instance, the automatic balls and strikes, this system. What's your opinion about this? Is it a myth that baseball was always without time, that there was this timelessness about it, literally? And do you think that these new things have somehow fouled the game? Old timers love to talk about how this game looks unrecognizable to them. But you
Yeah.
really placed all of this in perspective in your book. So I guess in summing up, is
But
baseball, how
it's a
does it
big
all
question.
work?
Yeah, I have a lot to say about it. All right, so the timelessness myth is complicated because it itself has different features. One is that baseball is not limited in time, and that's true.
Yeah.
Um, uh, but it's not true in all leagues. It's not true in Japan, and it's not true in lots of little league contexts. And there are organized baseball leagues where at a certain point the game is called,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So, so I think that is generally true of Major League Baseball, and it is interesting, but it's not universally true of baseball. So there's that. Then there's the idea that baseball doesn't feature a clock, uh, and that is true, and that sort of interesting because lots of sports do. But first of all, there are a lot of sports that don't. Tennis and volleyball don't feature a clock, right?
Hmm.
So it's
Hmm.
not it's true, it's not unique to baseball, but it is true and it is interesting. Um, and then the other is that baseball is leisurely. I don't know about that. I mean, I think baseball has always been concerned with uh, um, regulating pace. So it's not timeless in that sense. It's not like a sport where, uh, no one is concerned with the pace at which thing is happening. So, and it is a game that's about speed also. So I think time, the rubric of time lumps together a bunch of things that should be separated. Some of those are distinctive baseball, some of them are not. Some of those are consistently true throughout baseball history. Some of them are not. All that said, I actually don't think the pitch clock is a big deal. The pitch clock is not an instance of the clock regulating the game. It's really only the clock regulating pauses in the game. And
Hmm.
that's
Hmm.
different. So
Hmm.
if you're attached to the idea that baseball can go on endlessly, it still can, with pitch clock notwithstanding.
Hmm.
Now, the Major League Baseball does not want the game to go on endlessly because it believes that somehow that limits fan interest, and has done many things to try to speed up the game.
Hmm.
Um, uh, I think the most radical change, and there have been so many changes that have been designed to do that. Though I also point out some of those changes actually have the opposite effect. limiting defensive shifts and making stolen bases easier actually should slow the game. Should slow the game down, but also generates more offense. So that's the other thing baseball wants to do. Um, but the one radical thing I think is the what we call the Manfred Man, the ghost runner.
Yes.
That really does significantly reduce the
Hmm.
likelihood of a 25, 26 inning game. It doesn't
Yep.
eliminate it, of course,
Yep.
but it
Yep.
reduces it. And like many fans, I hate it. It annoys me. But that's really the only one that bugs me. Automatic ball strikes is super interesting because the one thing that really is genuinely different about baseball in the last 20 years from before is the role of video capture and sort of spatial location technologies. So knowing exactly where a ball is, how fast the bat moves, how fast the body moves, these are things that we, unlike the stuff with data and Moneyball, which is really old, these are things we really couldn't do very much of. We have radar guns for pitches, but that was about it until this generation, and that does change things. And because Major League Baseball decided to make visible to fans exactly where balls are in the moment on your phone or on the TV, I think uh, it did limit the tolerance that fans have for umpire misjudgments of balls and strikes. And so, in response to that, baseball's experimenting with automated ball and strike. Now, in the way that it's been implemented, I don't think it really changes that much because, as many of your listeners know, there are limits on how many times you can challenge.
Hmm.
Uh, those limits are typically exhausted, uh, and there's all kinds of strategy about their deployment. Uh, but also, what it means is that the same three people that always had to exercise judgment, four people really, about where a ball is relative to strike zone. So the pitcher, the catcher, the batter, and the umpire.
Hmm.
Those same four people are still the people who were exercising judgment. Uh, the umpire renders an initial judgment. The other
Hmm.
three figures are allowed to appeal, though typically it's going to be the catcher. It's almost never the pitcher, just because the catcher's success rate uh, is so much higher, which is an interesting phenomenon, which we could talk about. So, it still is a game where the players are strategically judging. You still do want to try to frame the pitch if you're a catcher to fool the umpire. You still want to move your body if you're a batter to fool the umpire. You still want to have the ball move a certain way for the pitcher to fool the umpire. I don't think it has changed any of that. Now, it may in the future because what will happen is as fans get more and more intolerant of umpire mistakes, or in other words, as fans come to think of balls and strikes as objective facts, something that the ABS system is contributing to, not only because it renders it immediately and transparently to everyone watching, but also because it doesn't even acknowledge any margin of error. These machines do have a margin of error, but there is no margin, there's no gray area. It'll tell you immediately, yes, the call is being overturned because it was zero point 0.1 inch into the strike zone. Fact,
Hmm.
right? That's
Hmm.
that's how we're presented. So after a few seasons of that, I think there's going to be initial pressure to raise the quota of acceptable challenges. And ultimately, people are just going to wonder why the umpire has a judgment at
Why is
all.
he there? Why is he there
If there
behind home plate?
right, if there is a fact, then then all the umpire should be doing is like a stadium announcer should be relaying to the fans what the machines have determined is the objective factual location
Hmm.
of a pitched ball relative to a strike zone. So I think ABS may in fact change something interesting and fun about the game, which is the trickery, the framing, also the fans yelling at the umpire, "You're missing a great game" and all that.
Right.
So we will miss that when it goes, but this isn't in the way that ABS has been implemented. This hasn't driven away the thing that we may like about it.
Do you think it will eventually drive away the home plate umpire, who may be there to call somebody out at the plate, but not calling balls and strikes?
Correct. I do think ultimate. I mean, I have no idea. Cause then the umpires have a union also, and I don't know what. But I do think it is likely to turn umpires into ball to safe out adjudicators and to relayers of the
Hmm.
ball strike call. I don't know if that
Yeah.
will happen in 3 years or in 10 years, but it just seems likely to happen. And when it does, you and I and many others might miss something about it. But I think also in the interim, you and I will also get frustrated, uh, as we were 4 or 5 years ago. CD Buckner would make a horrible call, and we know
Oh
that
God.
it changed the game, and you think like. The ball just was a strike. He called it a ball, and that's why
Yeah.
we lost. That kind of, or I'm a Cardinal fan, so 1985, Don Denkinger call
Ooh,
a safe call in what would have been the final game of that World Series,
that's right.
and he admits he looks at the replay,
He
he
blew
admits
it.
he was
Yeah.
wrong,
Yeah.
and those things are hard to let go of. So I understand the impulse to extend ABS. But yes, once it ultimately eliminates the ball strike adjudication of the umpire, there's something we will miss.
Yeah. One final question, just a quick one. So this is a fascinating book, but it is a rather slim one. Have you gotten everything out of you that you wanted to say between two covers about baseball?
No, I mean it's slim for the reason that Oxford's very short introduction series has a strict 35,000 word limit, and it was
Uh-huh.
painful. I eliminated whole chapters and replaced them with
Oh,
others. So there are a lot of things that I would have liked to write. I did have a chapter about baseball equipment, and
oh, I hope you're
the,
going to put that somewhere.
yeah, I don't know where to put it, but yeah. So no, they're. I don't know if I'll write another book about baseball, but I probably will write more about fandom. So maybe there'll be that. So yeah,
Well, it's fascinating. David Henkin is the author. The book is entitled Out of the Ballpark: How to Think About Baseball. It was published by Oxford University Press on March 16th of this year. David, thanks so much for coming on here and talking about baseball. Good luck with the Cardinals, and I look forward to
yeah.
talking with you again.
Good luck with the Braves, Stan, and it's always nice to talk to you. Thank you for having me on this.
My thanks to David Henkin for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at the Oxford University Press website at global.oup.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, as well as the czar of our Tallahassee office, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Crellin. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. If you're a fan of Today in Georgia History, and who isn't, check it out at the completely redesigned website at todayingeorgiahistory.org, and you can see it and hear it currently airing twice a day on TV and radio on Georgia Public Broadcasting. You can find this podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including Podchaser, YouTube and YouTube Music, Spotify, and of course, the podcast app on your phone. Wherever you listen or find it, please like, follow, subscribe, and share. And drop me a line, please, at sdeaton@georgiahistory.com. Be sure and like Off the Deaton Path on Facebook as well. You can also treat yourself to every Off the Deaton Path podcast, blog, and video ever created at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.